The worship of Dionysus. Herodotus seems to have believed that the worship and ceremonies of Dionysus generally were derived by the Greeks from Egypt, brought over by Cadmus and taught by him to Melampus, and the latter appears in the Hesiodic catalogue as having cured the daughters of Proteus of the mental distemper with which they had been smitten by Dionysus for rejecting his ritual. He cured them by introducing the Bacchic dance and fanatical excitement. This mythical incident is the most ancient mention of the Dionysian solemnities presented in the same character as they bear in Euripides. It is the general tendency of Herodotus to apply the theory of derivation from Egypt far too extensively to Greek institutions. The orgies of Dionysus were not originally borrowed from thence, though they may have been much modified by connection with Egypt as well as with Asia. The remarkable myth composed by Onomacritus respecting the dismemberment of Zagreus was founded upon an Egyptian tale very similar respecting the body of Osiris, who was supposed to be identical with Dionysus, nor was it unsuitable to the reckless fury of the Bacchanals during their state of temporary excitement, which found a still more awful expression in the myth of Pentheus torn in pieces by his own mother Agave at the head of her companions in the ceremony, as an intruder upon the feminine rites as well as a scoffer at the god. A passage in the Iliad, the authenticity of which has been contested, but even as an interpolation it must be old, also recounts how Lycurgus was struck blind by Zeus for having chased away with a whip the nurses of the mad Dionysus and frightened the god himself into the sea to take refuge in the arms of Thetis, and the fact that Dionysus is so frequently represented in his myths as encountering opposition and punishing the refractory, seems to indicate that his worship under its ecstatic form was a late phenomenon and introduced not without difficulty. The mythical Thracian Orpheus was attached as eponymous to a new sect, who seem to have celebrated the ceremonies of Dionysus with peculiar care, minuteness, and fervor, besides observing various rules in respect to food and clothing. It was the opinion of Herodotus that these rules, as well as the Pythagorean, were borrowed from Egypt. But whether this be the fact or not, the Orphic brotherhood is itself both an evidence, and a cause, of the increased importance of the worship of Dionysus, which indeed is attested by the great dramatic poets of Athens. The Homeric hymns present to us, however, the religious ideas and legends of the Greeks at an earlier period, when the enthusiastic and mystic tendencies had not yet acquired their full development. Though not referable to the same age or to the same author as either the Iliad or the Odyssey, they do to a certain extent continue the same stream of feeling, and the same mythical tone and coloring, as these poems manifesting but little evidence of Egyptian, Asiatic, or Thracian adulterations. The difference is striking between the god Dionysus as he appears in the Homeric hymn and in the Bacchae of Euripides. The hymnographer describes him as standing on the seashore, in the guise of a beautiful and richly clothed youth. When Tyrrhenian pirates suddenly approach, they seize and bind him and drag him on board their vessel. But the bonds which they employ burst spontaneously, and leave the god free. The steersman, perceiving this with affright, points out to his companions that they have unwittingly laid hands on a god, perhaps Zeus himself, or Apollo, or Poseidon. He conjures them to desist, and to replace Dionysus respectfully on the shore, lest in his wrath he should visit the ship with wind and hurricane, but the crew deride his scruples, and Dionysus is carried prisoner out to sea with the ship under full sail. Miraculous circumstances soon attest both his presence and his power. Sweet-scented wine is seen to flow spontaneously about the ship, the sail and mast appear adorned with vine and ivy leaves, and the oar-piece with garlands. The terrified crew, now too late, entreat the helmsman to steer his course for the shore, and crowd round him for protection on the poop. But their destruction is at hand. Dionysus assumes the form of a lion. A bear is seen standing near him. This bear rushes with a loud roar upon the captain, while the crew leap overboard in their agony of fright, and are changed into dolphins. Then remains none but the discreet and pious steersman, to whom Dionysus addresses words of affectionate encouragement, revealing his name, parentage, and dignity. This hymn, perhaps produced at the Naxian festival of Dionysus, and earlier than the time when the dithyrambic chorus became the established mode of singing the praise and glory of that god, is conceived in a spirit totally different from that of the Bacchic telati, or special rites which the Bacchae of Euripides so abundantly extol, rites introduced from Asia by Dionysus himself at the head of a thyasus or troop of enthusiastic women, inflaming with temporary frenzy the minds of the women of Thebes, not communicable except to those who approach as pious communicants, and followed by the most tragical results to all those who fight against the god. The Bacchic telati, and the Bacchic feminine frenzy, were importations from abroad, as Euripides represents them, and grafted upon the joviality of the primitive Greek Dionysia. They were borrowed, in all probability, from more than one source and introduced through more than one channel, the Orphic life or brotherhood being one of the varieties. Strabo ascribes to this latter a Thracian original, considering Orpheus, Mucius, and Eumolpus as having been all Thracians. It is curious to observe how, in the Bacchae of Euripides, the two distinct and even conflicting ideas of Dionysus come alternately forward, sometimes the old Greek idea of the jolly and exhilarating god of wine, but more frequently the recent and imported idea of the terrific and irresistible god who unseats the reason, and whose power can only be appeased by a willing, though temporary obedience. In the fanatical impulse which inspired the votaries of the Asiatic Rhea or Cybele, or of the Thracian Cotes, there was nothing of spontaneous joy. It was a sacred madness, during which the soul appeared to be surrendered to a stimulus from without, and accompanied by preternatural strength and temporary sense of power, altogether distinct from the unrestrained hilarity of the original Dionysia, as we see them in the rural Attica, or in the gay city of Tarentum. There was indeed a side on which the two bore some analogy, inasmuch as, according to the religious point of view of the Greeks, even the spontaneous joy of the vintage feast was conferred by the favor and enlivened by the companionship of Dionysus. It was upon this analogy that the framers of the Bacchic orgies proceeded, but they did not the less disfigure the genuine character of the old Greek Dionysia. Dionysus is in the conception of Pindar, the paertos or companion in worship of Demeter. The worship and religious estimate of the latter has by that time undergone as great a change as that of the former. If we take our comparison with the brief description of Homer and Hesiod, she has acquired much of the awful and soul-disturbing attributes of the Phrygian Cybele. In Homer, Demeter is the goddess of the cornfield, who becomes attached to the mortal man Jason, an unhappy passion, since Zeus, jealous of the connection between goddesses and men, puts him to death. In the Hesiodic theogony, Demeter is the mother of Persephone by Zeus, who permits Hades to carry off the latter as his wife. Moreover, Demeter has, besides, by Jason a son called Pintos, born in Crete. Even from Homer to Hesiod, the legend of Demeter has been expanded and her dignity exalted. According to the usual tendency of Greek legend, the expansion goes on still further. Through Jason, Demeter becomes connected with the mysteries of Samothrace, through Persephone, with those of Eleusis. The former connection it is difficult to follow out in detail, but the latter is explained and traced to its origin in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Though we find different statements respecting the date as well as the origin of the Eleusinian mysteries, yet the popular belief of the Athenians, and the story which found favor at Eleusis, ascribed them to the presence and dictation of the goddess Demeter herself, just as the Bacchic rites are, according to the Bacchae of Euripides, first communicated and enforced on the Greeks by the personal visit of Dionysus to Thebes, the metropolis of the Bacchic ceremonies. In the Eleusinian legend, preserved by the author of the Homeric hymn, she comes voluntarily and identifies herself with Eleusis, her past abode in Crete being briefly indicated. Her visit to Eleusis is connected with the deep sorrow caused by the loss of her daughter Persephone, who had been seized by Hades, while gathering flowers in a meadow along with the oceanic nymphs, and carried off to become his wife in the underworld. In vain did the reluctant Persephone shriek and invoke the aid of her father Zeus. He had consented to give her to Hades, and her cries were heard only by Hecate and Helios. Demeter was inconsolable at the disappearance of her daughter, but knew not where to look for her. She wandered for 9 days and nights with torches in search of the lost maiden without success. At length Helios, the spy of gods and men, revealed to her, in reply to her urgent prayer, the rape of Persephone, and the permission given to Hades by Zeus. Demeter was smitten with anger and despair. She renounced Zeus and the society of Olympus, abstained from nectar and ambrosia, and wandered on earth in grief and fasting until her form could no longer be known. In this condition she came to Eleusis, then governed by the prince Helios. Sitting down by a well at the wayside in the guise of an old woman, she was found by the daughters of Helios, who came hither with their pails of brass for water. In reply to their questions, she told them that she had been brought by pirates from Crete to Thoricos, and had made her escape. She then solicited from them succor and employment as a servant or as a nurse. The damsels prevailed upon their mother Metanira to receive her, and to entrust her with the nursing of the young Demophoon, their late-born brother, the only son of Helios. Demeter was received into the house of Metanira, her dignified form still borne down by grief. She sat long silent and could not be induced either to smile or to taste food, until the maidservant Iambe, by jests and playfulness, succeeded in amusing and rendering her cheerful. She would not taste wine, but requested a peculiar mixture of barley meal with water and the herb mint. The child Demophoon, nursed by Demeter, throve and grew up like a god. To the delight and astonishment of his parents, she gave him no food, but anointed him daily with ambrosia, and plunged him at night in the fire like a torch, where he remained unburnt. She would have rendered him immortal, had she not been prevented by the indiscreet curiosity and alarm of Metanira, who secretly looked in at night, and shrieked with horror at the sight of her child in the fire. The indignant goddess, setting the infant on the ground, now revealed her true character to Metanira. Her wan and aged look disappeared, and she stood dressed in the genuine majesty of her divine shape, diffusing a dazzling brightness which illuminated the whole house. "Foolish mother," she said, "thy want of faith has robbed thy son of immortal life. I am the exalted Demeter, the charm and comfort both of gods and men. I was preparing for thy son exemption from death and old age. Now it cannot be, but he must taste of both. Yet shall he be ever honored, since he has sat upon my knee and slept in my arms. Let the people of Eleusis erect for me a temple and altar on yonder hill above the fountain. I will myself prescribe to them the orgies which they must religiously perform in order to propitiate my favor." The terrified Metanira was incapable even of lifting up her child from the ground. Her daughters entered at her cries, and began to embrace and tend their infant brother, but besorrowed and could not be pacified for the loss of his divine nurse. All night they strove to appease the goddess. Strictly executing the injunctions of Demeter, Helios convoked the people of Eleusis and erected the temple on the spot which she had pointed out. It was speedily completed, and Demeter took up her abode in it, apart from the remaining gods, still pining with grief for the loss of her daughter, and withholding her beneficent aid from mortals. And thus she remained a whole year, a desperate and terrible year. In vain did the oxen draw the plough, and in vain was the barley seed cast into the furrow. Demeter suffered it not to emerge from the earth. The human race would have been starved, and the gods would have been deprived of their honors and sacrifice, had not Zeus found means to conciliate her. But this was a hard task, for Demeter resisted the entreaties of Iris and of all the other goddesses and gods whom Zeus successively sent to her. She would be satisfied with nothing less than the recovery of her daughter. At length Zeus sent Hermes to Hades, to bring Persephone away. Persephone joyfully obeyed, but Hades prevailed upon her before she departed to swallow a grain of pomegranate, which rendered it impossible for her to remain the whole year away from him. With transport did Demeter receive back her lost daughter, and the faithful Hecate sympathized in the delight felt by both at the reunion. It was now an easier undertaking to reconcile her with the gods. Her mother Rhea, sent down expressly by Zeus, descended from Olympus on the fertile Rhaeran plain. Then smitten with barrenness like the rest of the earth, she succeeded in appeasing the indignation of Demeter, who consented again to put forth her relieving hand. The buried seed came up in abundance, and the earth was covered with fruit and flowers. She would have wished to retain Persephone constantly with her, but this was impossible, and she was obliged to consent that her daughter should go down for 1/3 of each year to the house of Hades, departing from her every spring at the time when the seed is sown. She then revisited Olympus, again to dwell with the gods, but before her departure, she communicated to the daughters of Helios, and to Helios himself, together with Triptolemus, Diocles, and Eumolpus, the divine service and the solemnities which she required to be observed in her honor. And thus began the venerable mysteries of Eleusis, at her special command. The lesser mysteries, celebrated in February, in honor of Persephone, the greater, in August, to the honor of Demeter herself. Both are jointly patronesses of the holy city and temple. Such is a brief sketch of the temple legend of Eleusis, set forth at length in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. It is interesting not less as a picture of the Mater Dolorosa. In the mouth of an Athenian, Demeter and Persephone were always the mother and daughter, by excellence, first an agonized sufferer, and then finally glorified, the weal and woe of man being dependent upon her kindly feeling, than as an illustration of the nature and of Greek legend generally. Though we now read this hymn as pleasing poetry, to the Eleusinians, for whom it was composed, it was genuine and sacred history. They believed in the visit of Demeter to Eleusis, and in the mysteries as a revelation from her, as implicitly as they believed in her existence and power as a goddess. The Eleusinian psalmist shares this belief in common with his countrymen, and embodies it in a continuous narrative, in which the great goddesses of the place, as well as the great heroic families, figure in inseparable conjunction. Helios is the son of the eponymous hero Eleusis, and his daughters, with the old epic simplicity, carry their basins to the well for water. Eumolpus, Triptolemus, Diocles, heroic ancestors of the privileged families who continued throughout the historical times of Athens to fulfill their special hereditary functions in the Eleusinian solemnities, are among the immediate recipients of inspiration from the goddess, but chiefly does she favor Metanera and her infant son Demophoon, for the latter of whom her greatest boon is destined, and intercepted only by the weak faith of the mother. Moreover, every incident in the hymn has a local coloring and a special reference. The well, overshadowed by an olive tree near which Demeter had rested. The stream Callichorus and the Temple Hill were familiar and interesting places in the eyes of every Eleusinian. The peculiar posset prepared from barley meal with mint was always tasted by the mists, or communicants, after a prescribed fast, as an article in the ceremony, while it was also the custom, at a particular spot in the processional march, to permit the free interchange of personal jokes and taunts upon individuals for the general amusement. And these two customs are connected in the hymn with the incidents that Demeter herself had chosen the posset as the first interruption of her long and melancholy fast, and that her sorrowful thoughts had been partially diverted by the coarse playfulness of the servant-maid Iambe. In the enlarged representation of the Eleusinian ceremonies, which became established after the incorporation of Eleusis with Athens, the part of Iambe herself was enacted by a woman, or man in woman's attire, of suitable wit and imagination, who was posted on the bridge over the Kephisos, and addressed to the passers-by in the procession, especially the great men of Athens, saucy jeers, probably not less piercing than those of Aristophanes on the stage. The torch-bearing Hecate received a portion of the worship in the nocturnal ceremonies of the Eleusinia. This too is traced, in the hymn, to her kind and affectionate sympathy with the great goddesses. Though all these incidents were sincerely believed by the Eleusinians as a true history of the past, and as having been the real initiatory cause of their own solemnities, it is not the less certain that they are simply myths or legends, and not to be treated as history, either actual or exaggerated. They do not take their start from realities of the past, but from realities of the present, combined with retrospective feeling and fancy, which fills up the blank of the aforetime in a manner at once plausible and impressive. What proportion of fact there may be in the legend, or whether there be any at all, it is impossible to ascertain and useless to inquire, for the story did not acquire belief from its approximation to real fact, but from its perfect harmony with Eleusinian faith and feeling, and from the absence of any standard of historical credibility. The little town of Eleusis derived all its importance from the solemnity of the Demetria, and the hymn which we have been considering, probably at least as old as 600 BC, represents the town as it stood before its absorption into the larger unity of Athens, which seems to have produced an alteration of its legends and an increase of dignity in its great festival. In the faith of an Eleusinian, the religious as well as the patriotic antiquities of his native town were connected with this capital solemnity. The divine legend of the sufferings of Demeter and her visit to Eleusis was to him that which the heroic legend of Adrastus and the siege of Thebes was to a Sicinian, or that of Erechtheus and Athene to an Athenian grouping together in the same scene and story the goddess and the heroic fathers of the town. If our information were fuller, we should probably find abundance of other legends respecting the Demetria, the Gephori of Athens, to whom belonged the celebrated Harmodios and Aristogeiton, and who possessed special orgies of Demeter the Sorrowful, to which no man foreign to their gens was ever admitted, would doubtless have told stories not only different but contradictory, and even in other Eleusinian myths we discover Eumolpus as king of Eleusis, son of Poseidon, and a Thracian, completely different from the character which he bears in the hymn before us. Neither discrepancies nor want of evidence, in reference to alleged antiquities, shocked the faith of a non-historical public. What they wanted was a picture of the past, impressive to their feelings and plausible to their imagination, and it is important to the reader to remember, while he reads either the divine legends which we are now illustrating or the heroic legends to which we shall soon approach, that he is dealing with a past which never was present, a region essentially mythical, neither approachable by the critic nor mensurable by the chronologer. The tale respecting the visit of Demeter, which was told by the ancient gens, called the Phytalids, in reference to another temple of Demeter between Athens and Eleusis, and also by the Megarians in reference to a deemed Trion near their city, acquired under the auspices of Athens still further extension. The goddess was reported to have first communicated to Triptolemus at Eleusis the art of sowing corn, which by his intervention was disseminated all over the earth. And thus the Athenians took credit to themselves for having been the medium of communication from the gods to man of all the inestimable blessings of agriculture, which they affirmed to have been first exhibited on the fertile Marian plain near Eleusis. Such pretensions are not to be found in the old Homeric hymn. The festival of the Thesmophoria, celebrated in honor of Demeter Thesmophoros at Athens, was altogether different from the Eleusinia, in this material respect, as well as others, that all males were excluded, and women only were allowed to partake in it. The surname Thesmophorus gave occasion to new legends in which the goddess was glorified as the first authoress of laws and legal sanctions to mankind. This festival, for women apart and alone, was also celebrated at Paros, at Ephesus, and in many other parts of Greece. Altogether, Demeter and Dionysus, as the Grecian counterparts of the Egyptian Isis and Osiris, seem to have been the great recipients of the new sacred rites borrowed from Egypt, before the worship of Isis in her own name was introduced into Greece. Their solemnities became more frequently recluse and mysterious than those of the other deities. The importance of Demeter to the collective nationality of Greece may be gathered from the fact that her temple was erected at Thermopylae, the spot where the Amphictyonic assemblies were held, close by the temple of the eponymous hero Amphictyon himself, and under the surname of the Amphictyonic Demeter. We now pass to another and not less important celestial personage, Apollo. Homeric hymn to Apollo. The legends of Delos and Delphi, embodied in the Homeric hymn to Apollo, indicate, if not a greater dignity, at least a more widely diffused worship of that god than even of Demeter. The hymn is, in point of fact, an aggregate of two separate compositions, one emanating from an Ionic bard at Delos, the other from Delphi. The first details the birth, the second the mature divine efficiency, of Apollo, but both alike present the unaffected charm as well as the characteristic peculiarities of Greek mythical narrative. The hymnographer sings, and his hearers accept in perfect good faith, a history of the past, but it is a past, imagined partly as an introductory explanation to the present, partly as a means of glorifying the god. The island of Delos was the accredited birthplace of Apollo, and is also the place in which he chiefly delights, where the great and brilliant Ionic festival is periodically convened in his honor. Yet it is a rock narrow, barren, and uninviting. How came so glorious a privilege to be awarded to it? This the poet takes upon himself to explain. Leto, pregnant with Apollo, and persecuted by the jealous Hera, could find no spot wherein to give birth to her offspring. In vain did she address herself to numerous places in Greece, the Asiatic coast and the intermediate islands. All were terrified at the wrath of Hera, and refused to harbor her. As a last resort, she approached the rejected and repulsive island of Delos, and promised that, if shelter were granted to her in her forlorn condition, the island should become the chosen resort of Apollo as well as the site of his temple with its rich accompanying solemnities. Delos joyfully consented, but not without many apprehensions that the potent Apollo would despise her unworthiness, and not without exacting a formal oath from Leto, who was then admitted to the desired protection, and duly accomplished her long and painful labor. Though Diane, Rhea, Themis, and Amphitrite came to soothe and succor her, yet Hera kept away the goddess presiding over childbirth, Eileithyia, and thus cruelly prolonged her pangs. At length Eileithyia came, and Apollo was born. Hardly had Apollo tasted, from the hands of Themis, the immortal food, nectar, and ambrosia, when he burst at once his infant bands, and displayed himself in full divine form and strength, claiming his characteristic attributes of the bow and the harp, and his privileged function of announcing beforehand to mankind the designs of Zeus. The promise made by Leto to Delos was faithfully performed, amidst the numberless other temples and groves which men provided for him. He ever preferred that island as his permanent residence, and there the Ionians with their wives and children, and all their bravery, congregated periodically from their different cities to glorify him. Dance and song and athletic contests adorned the solemnity, and the countless ships, wealth, and grace of the multitudinous Ionians had the air of an assembly of gods. The Delian maidens, servants of Apollo, sang hymns to the glory of the god, as well as of Artemis and Leto, intermingled with adventures of foregone men and women, to the delight of the listening crowd. The blind itinerant bard of Chios, composer of this the Homeric hymn, and confounded in antiquity with the author of the Iliad, had found honor and acceptance at this festival, and commends himself, in a touching farewell strain, to the remembrance and sympathy of the Delian maidens. But Delos was not an oracular spot. Apollo did not manifest himself there as revealer of the futurities of Zeus. A place must be found where this beneficent function, without which mankind would perish under the innumerable doubts and perplexities of life, may be exercised and rendered available. Apollo himself descends from Olympus to make choice of a suitable site. The hymnographer knows 1,000 other adventures of the god which he might sing, but he prefers this memorable incident, the charter and patent of consecration for the Delphian temple. Many different places did Apollo inspect. He surveyed the country of the Magnates and the Peribians, came to Iolcos, and passed over from thence to Euboea and the plain of Lelantine. But even this fertile spot did not please him. He crossed the Euripus to Boeotia, passed by Diomessus and Mycaletius, and the then inaccessible and unoccupied forest on which the city of Thebes afterwards stood. He next proceeded to Onchystos, but the grove of Poseidon was already established there, next across the Cephisus to Ocalia, Haliartus, and the agreeable plain and much frequented fountain of Delphusa, or Tilphusa. Pleased with the place, Apollo prepared to establish his oracle there, but Tilphusa was proud of the beauty of her own site, and did not choose that her glory should be eclipsed by that of the god. She alarmed him with the apprehension that the chariots which contended in her plain, and the horses and mules which watered at her fountain would disturb the solemnity of his oracle, and she thus induced him to proceed onward to the southern side of Parnassus, overhanging the harbor of Crissa. Here he established his oracle, in the mountainous site not frequented by chariots and horses, and near to a fountain, which however was guarded by a vast and terrific serpent, once the nurse of the monster Typhaon. This serpent Apollo slew with an arrow, and suffered its body to rot in the sun, hence the name of the place, Pith, and the surname of the Pythian Apollo. The plan of his temple being marked out, it was built by Trophonius and Agamedes, aided by a crowd of forward auxiliaries from the neighborhood. He now discovered with indignation, however, that Tilphusa had cheated him, and went back with swift step to resent it. "Thou shalt not thus," he said, "succeed in thy fraud and retain thy beautiful water. The glory of the place shall be mine, and not thine alone." Thus saying, he tumbled down a crag upon the fountain, and obstructed her limpid current, establishing an altar for himself in a grove hard by near another spring, where men still worship him as Apollo Tilphusios, because of his severe vengeance upon the once beautiful Tilphusa. Apollo next stood in need of chosen ministers to take care of his temple and sacrifice, and to pronounce his responses at Pytho. Descrying a ship, containing many and good men, bound on traffic from the Minoian Knossos in Crete, to Pylos in Peloponnesus, he resolved to make use of the ship and her crew for his purpose. Assuming the shape of a vast dolphin, he splashed about and shook the vessel so as to strike the mariners with terror, while he sent a strong wind, which impelled her along the coast of Peloponnesus into the Corinthian Gulf, and finally to the harbor of Chrysa, where she ran aground. The affrighted crew did not dare to disembark, but Apollo was seen standing on the shore in the guise of a vigorous youth, and inquired who they were, and what was their business. The leader of the Cretans recounted in reply their miraculous and compulsory voyage, when Apollo revealed himself as the author and contriver of it, announcing to them the honorable function and the dignified post to which he destined them. They followed him by his orders to the rocky Pytho on Parnassus, singing the Psalmiopean such as it is sung in Crete, while the god himself marched at their head, with his fine form and lofty step, playing on the harp. He showed them the temple and site of the oracle, and directed them to worship him as Apollo Delphinios, because they bad first seen him in the shape of a dolphin. But how, they inquired, are we to live in a spot where there is neither corn, nor vine, nor pasturage? Ye silly mortals, answered the god, who look only for toil and privation, know that an easier lot is yours. Ye shall live by the cattle whom crowds of pious visitors will bring to the temple, ye shall need only the knife to be constantly ready for sacrifice. Your duty will be to guard my temple, and to officiate as ministers at my feasts, but if ye be guilty of wrong or insolence, either by word or deed, ye shall become the slaves of other men, and shall remain so forever. Take heed of the word and the warning. Such are the legends of Delos and Delphi, according to the Homeric hymn to Apollo. The specific functions of the god, and the chief localities of his worship, together, with the surnames attached to them, are thus historically explained, being connected with his past acts and adventures. Though these are to us only interesting poetry, yet to those who heard them sung they possessed all the requisites of history, and were fully believed as such, not because they were partially founded in reality, but because they ran in complete harmony with the feelings, and, so long as that condition was fulfilled, it was not the fashion of the time to canvass truth or falsehood. The narrative is purely personal, without any discernible symbolized doctrine or allegory, to serve as a supposed ulterior purpose. The particular deeds ascribed to Apollo grow out of the general preconceptions as to his attributes, combined with the present realities of his worship. It is neither history nor allegory, but simple myth or legend. Worship of Apollo. The worship of Apollo is among the most ancient, capital, and strongly marked facts of the Greek world, and widely diffused over every branch of the race. It is older than the Iliad or Odyssey, in the latter of which both Pytho and Delos are noted, though Delos is not named in the former. But the ancient Apollo is different in more respects than one from the Apollo of later times. He is in an especial manner the god of the Trojans, unfriendly to the Greeks, and especially to Achilles. He has, moreover, only two primary attributes, his bow and his prophetic powers, without any distinct connection either with the harp, or with medicine, or with the sun, all which in later times he came to comprehend. He is not only, as Apollo Carneus, the chief god of the Doric race, but also, under the surname of Petrus, the great protecting divinity of the Gentile tie among the Ionians. He is moreover the guide and stimulus to Greek colonization, scarcely any colony being ever sent out without encouragement and direction from the oracle at Delphi, Apollo Archegetes is one of his great surnames. His temple lends sanctity to the meetings of the Amphictyonic assembly, and he is always in filial subordination and harmony with his father Zeus. Delphi and Olympia are never found in conflict. In the Iliad, the warm and earnest patrons of the Greeks are Hera, Athena, and Poseidon. Here too Zeus and Apollo are seen in harmony, for Zeus is decidedly well inclined to the Trojans, and reluctantly sacrifices them to the importunity of the two great goddesses. The worship of the Sminthian Apollo, in various parts of the Troad and the neighboring territory, dates before the earliest periods of colonization, hence the zealous patronage of Troy ascribed to him in the Iliad. Altogether, however, the distribution and partialities of the gods in that poem are different from what they become in later times, a difference which our means of information do not enable us satisfactorily to explain. Besides the Delphian temple, Apollo had numerous temples throughout Greece, and oracles at Abi in Phocis, on the Mount Tuan, and at Tagira in Boeotia, where he was said to have been born, at Branchidae near Miletus, at Clarus in Asia Minor, and at Patara in Lycia. He was not the only oracular god. Zeus at Dodona and at Olympia gave responses also. The gods or heroes Trophonius, Amphiaraus, Amphilochus, Mopsus, etc., each at his own sanctuary and in his own prescribed manner, rendered the same service. The two legends of Delphi and Delos, above noticed, form of course a very insignificant fraction of the narratives which once existed respecting the great and venerated Apollo. They serve only as specimens, and as very early specimens, to illustrate what these divine myths were, and what was the turn of Greek faith and imagination. The constantly recurring festivals of the gods caused an incessant demand for new myths respecting them, or at least for varieties and reproductions of the old myths. Even during the 3rd century of the Christian era, in the time of the reader Menander, when the old forms of paganism were waning and when the stock of myths in existence was extremely abundant, we see this demand in great force, but it was incomparably more operative in those earlier times when the creative vein of the Grecian mind yet retained its pristine and unfaded richness. Each god had many different surnames, temples, groves, and solemnities, with each of which was connected more or less of mythical narrative, originally hatched in the prolific and spontaneous fancy of a believing neighborhood, to be afterwards expanded, adorned, and diffused by the song of the poet. The earliest subject of competition at the great Pythian festival was the singing of a hymn in honor of Apollo. Other agons were subsequently added, but the ode or hymn constituted the fundamental attribute of the solemnity. The Pythia at Sicyon and elsewhere were probably framed on a similar footing. So too at the ancient and celebrated Charitesia, or Festival of the Chariots, at Orchomenos, the rivalry of the poets in their various modes of composition both began and continued as the predominant feature, and the inestimable treasures yet remaining to us of Attic tragedy and comedy, are gleanings from the once numerous dramas exhibited at the solemnity of the Dionysia. The Ephesians gave considerable rewards for the best hymns in honor of Artemis, to be sung at her temple. And the early lyric poets of Greece, though their works have not descended to us, devoted their genius largely to similar productions, as may be seen by the titles and fragments yet remaining. Both the Christian and the Mahometan religions have begun during the historical age, have been propagated from one common center, and have been erected upon the ruins of a different pre-existing faith. With none of these particulars did Greek paganism correspond. It took rise in an age of imagination and feeling simply, without the restraints, as well as without the aid of writing or records, of history or philosophy. It was, as a general rule, the spontaneous product of many separate tribes and localities, imitation and propagation operating as subordinate causes. It was moreover a primordial faith, as far as our means of information enable us to discover. These considerations explain to us two facts in the history of the early pagan mind. First, the divine myths, the matter of their religion, constituted also the matter of their earliest history. Next, these myths harmonized with each other only in their general types, but differed incurably in respect of particular incidents. The poet who sung a new adventure of Apollo, the trace of which he might have heard in some remote locality, would take care that it should be agreeable to the general conceptions which his hearers entertained respecting the god. He would not ascribe the amorous influences to Athena, nor armed interference and the aegis to Aphrodite, but, provided he maintained this general keeping, he might indulge his fancy without restraint in the particular events of the story. The feelings and faith of his hearers went along with him, and there were no critical scruples to hold them back. To scrutinize the alleged proceedings of the gods was repulsive, and to disbelieve them impious. And thus these divine myths, though they had their root simply in religious feelings, and though they presented great discrepancies of fact, served nevertheless as primitive matter of history to an early Greek. They were the only narratives, at once publicly accredited and interesting, which he possessed. To them were aggregated the heroic myths, to which we shall proceed presently. Indeed, the two are inseparably blended, gods, heroes and men almost always appearing in the same picture, analogous both in their structure and their genesis, and differing chiefly in the circumstance that they sprang from the type of a hero instead of from that of a god. Aphrodite and Athens. We are not to be astonished if we find Aphrodite, in the Iliad, born from Zeus and Dione, and in the Theogony of Hesiod, generated from the foam on the sea after the mutilation of Uranos, nor if in the Odyssey she appears as the wife of Hephaestus, while in the Theogony the latter is married to Aglaia, and Aphrodite is described as mother of 3 children by Ares. The Homeric hymn to Aphrodite details the legend of Aphrodite and Anchises, which is presupposed in the Iliad as the parentage of Aeneas, but the author of the hymn, probably sung at one of the festivals of Aphrodite in Cyprus, represents the goddess as ashamed of her passion for a mortal, and as enjoining Anchises under severe menaces not to reveal who the mother of Aeneas was, while in the Iliad she has no scruple in publicly owning him, and he passes everywhere as her acknowledged son. Aphrodite is described in the hymn as herself cold and unimpressible, but ever active and irresistible in inspiring amorous feelings to gods, to men, and to animals. 3 goddesses are recorded as memorable exceptions to her universal empire: Athena, Artemis, and Hestia or Vesta. Aphrodite was one of the most important of all the goddesses in the mythical world, for the number of interesting, pathetic, and tragical adventures deducible from misplaced or unhappy passion was of course very great, and in most of these cases the intervention of Aphrodite was usually prefixed, with some legend to explain why she manifested herself. Her range of action grows wider in the later epic and lyric and tragic poets than in Homer. Athena, the man-goddess, born from the head of Zeus, without a mother and without feminine sympathies, is the antithesis partly of Aphrodite, partly of the effeminate or womanized god Dionysus. The latter is an importation from Asia, but Athena is a Greek conception, the type of composed, majestic and unrelenting force. It appears, however, as if this goddess had been conceived in a different manner in different parts of Greece. For we find ascribed to her, in some of the legends, attributes of industry and home-keeping. She is represented as the companion of Hephaestus, patronizing handicraft, and expert at the loom and the spindle. The Athenian potters worshipped her along with Prometheus. Such traits of character do not square with the formidable aegis and the massive and crushing spear which Homer and most of the myths assign to her. There probably were at first at least two different types of Athena, and their coalescence has partially obliterated the less marked of the two. Athena is the constant and watchful protectress of Heracles. She is also locally identified with the soil and people of Athens. Even in the Iliad, Erechtheus, the Athenian, is born of the earth, but Athena brings him up, nourishes him, and lodges him in her own temple, where the Athenians annually worship him with sacrifice and solemnities. It was altogether impossible to make Erechtheus son of Athena. The type of the goddess forbade it, but the Athenian myth creators, though they found this barrier impassable, strove to approach to it as near as they could, and the description which they give of the birth of Erichthonios, at once unhomeric and unseemly, presents something like the phantom of maternity. Artemis and Poseidon. The huntress Artemis, in Arcadia, and in Greece proper generally, exhibits a well-defined type with which the legends respecting her are tolerably consistent. But the Ephesian as well as the Tauric Artemis partakes more of the Asiatic character, and has borrowed the attributes of the Lydian Great Mother as well as of an indigenous Tauric virgin. This Ephesian Artemis passed to the colonies of Phocea and Miletus. The Homeric Artemis shares with her brother Apollo in the dexterous use of the far-striking bow, and sudden death is described by the poet as inflicted by her gentle arrow. The jealousy of the gods at the withholding of honors and sacrifices, or at the presumption of mortals in contending with them, a point of character so frequently recurring in the types of the Grecian gods, manifests itself in the legends of Artemis. The memorable Caledonian boar is sent by her as a visitation upon Eneas, because he bad omitted to sacrifice to her, while he did honor to other gods. The Arcadian heroine Atalanta is however a reproduction of Artemis, with little or no difference, and the goddess is sometimes confounded even with her attendant nymphs. The mighty Poseidon, the earth-shaker and the ruler of the sea, is second only to Zeus in power, but has no share in those imperial and superintending capacities which the father of gods and men exhibits. He numbers a numerous heroic progeny, usually men of great corporeal strength, and many of them belonging to the Aeolic race. The great Nereid family of Pylus trace their origin up to him, and he is also the father of Polyphemus the Cyclops, whose well-earned suffering be cruelly revenges upon Odysseus. The island of Caloria is his Delos, and there was held in it an old local Amphictyony, for the purpose of rendering to him joint honor and sacrifice. The Isthmus of Corinth, Helice in Achaia, and Onkistos in Boeotia, are also residences which he much affects, and where he is solemnly worshipped. But the abode which he originally and specially selected for himself was the Acropolis of Athens, where by a blow of his trident he produced a well of water in the rock. Athena came afterwards and claimed the spot for herself, planting in token of possession the olive tree which stood in the sacred grove of Pandrosus, and the decision either of the autochthonous Cecrops, or of Erechtheus, awarded to her the preference, mock to the displeasure of Poseidon. Either on this account, or on account of the death of his son Eumolpus, slain in assisting the Eleusinians against Erechtheus, the Attic myths ascribe to Poseidon great enmity against the Erechtheid family, which he is asserted to have ultimately overthrown. Theseus, whose glorious reign and deeds succeeded to that family, is said to have been really his son. In several other places, in Aegina, Argos, and Naxos, Poseidon had disputed the privileges of patron god with Zeus, Hera, and Dionysus. He was worsted in all, but bore his defeat patiently. Poseidon endured a long slavery, in common with Apollo, gods as they were, under Laomedon, king of Troy. At the command and condemnation of Zeus, the two gods rebuilt the walls of the city, which had been destroyed by Heracles. When their time was expired, the insolent Laomedon withheld from them the stipulated reward, and even accompanied its refusal with appalling threats, and the subsequent animosity of the god against Troy was greatly determined by the sentiment of this injustice. Such periods of servitude, inflicted upon individual gods, are among the most remarkable of all the incidents in the divine legends. We find Apollo on another occasion condemned to serve Admetus, king of Pheræ, as a punishment for having killed the Cyclops, and Heracles also is sold as a slave to Omphale. Even the fierce Ares, overpowered and imprisoned for a long time by the two Aloids, is ultimately liberated only by extraneous aid. Such narratives attest the discursive range of Greek fancy in reference to the gods, as well as the perfect commingling of things and persons, divine and human, in their conceptions of the past. The god who serves is for the time degraded, but the supreme God who commands the servitude is in the like proportion exalted, whilst the idea of some sort of order and government among these superhuman beings was never lost sight of. Nevertheless, the myths respecting the servitude of the gods became obnoxious afterwards, along with many others, to severe criticism on the part of philosophers. Hera, Hephaestus, and Hermes. The proud, jealous, and bitter Hera, the goddess of the once wealthy Mycenae, the fax et focus of the Trojan War, and the ever-present protectress of Jason in the Argonautic expedition, occupies an indispensable station in the mythical world. As the daughter of Cronus and wife of Zeus, she fills a throne from whence he cannot dislodge her, and which gives her a right perpetually to grumble and to thwart him. Her unmeasured jealousy of the female favorites of Zeus, and her antipathy against his sons, especially against Heracles, has been the suggesting cause of innumerable myths. The general type of her character stands here clearly marked, as furnishing both stimulus and guide to the mythopoeic fancy. The sacred wedding, or marriage of Zeus and Hera, was familiar to epithalamic poets long before it became a theme for the spiritualizing ingenuity of critics. Hephaestus is the son of Hera without a father, and stands to her in the same relation as Athena to Zeus. Her pride and want of sympathy are manifested by her casting him out at once in consequence of his deformity. He is the god of fire, and especially of fire in its practical applications to handicraft, and is indispensable as the right hand and instrument of the gods. His skill and his deformity appear alternately as the source Herm Aesop mythical stories, wherever exquisite and effective fabrication is intended to be designated. Hephaestus is announced as the maker, although in this function the type of his character is reproduced in Daedalus. In the Attic legends he appears intimately united both with Prometheus and with Athena, in conjunction with whom he was worshipped at Colonus near Athens. Lemnos was the favorite residence of Hephaestus, and if we possessed more knowledge of this island and its town Hephaestus, we should doubtless find abundant legends detailing his adventures and interventions. The chaste, still, and home-keeping Hestia, goddess of the family hearth, is far less fruitful in mythical narratives, in spite of her very superior dignity, than the knavish, smooth-torqued, keen, and acquisitive Hermes. His function of messenger of the gods brings him perpetually on the stage, and affords ample scope for portraying the features of his character. The Homeric hymn to Hermes describes the scene and circumstances of his birth, and the almost instantaneous manifestation, even in infancy, of his peculiar attributes. It explains the friendly footing on which he stood with Apollo, the interchange of gifts and functions between them, and lastly, the inviolate security of all the wealth and offerings in the Delphian temple, exposed as they were to thieves without any visible protection. Such was the innate cleverness and talent of Hermes, that on the day he was born he invented the lyre, stringing the 7 chords on the shell of a tortoise, and he also stole the cattle of Apollo in Pieria, dragging them backwards to his cave in Arcadia, so that their track could not be detected. To the remonstrances of his mother Maia, who points out to him the danger of offending Apollo, Hermes replies that he aspires to rival the dignity and functions of Apollo among the immortals, and that if his father Zeus refuses to grant them to him, he will employ his powers of thieving in breaking open the sanctuary at Delphi, and in carrying away the gold and the vestments, the precious tripods and vessels. Presently Apollo discovers the loss of his cattle, and after some trouble finds his way to the Cylenian cavern, where he sees Hermes asleep in his cradle. The child denies the theft with effrontery, and even treats the surmise as a ridiculous impossibility. He persists in such denial even before Zeus, who however detects him at once, and compels him to reveal the place where the cattle are concealed. But the lyre was as yet unknown to Apollo, who has heard nothing except the voice of the Muses and the sound of the pipe. So powerfully is life fascinated by hearing the tones of the lyre from Hermes, and so eager to become possessed of it, that he is willing at once to pardon the past theft, and even to conciliate besides the friendship of Hermes. Accordingly a bargain is struck between the 2 gods and sanctioned by Zeus. Hermes surrenders to Apollo the lyre, inventing for his own use the syrinx or Pan's pipe, and receiving from Apollo in exchange the golden rod of wealth, with empire over flocks and herds as well as over horses and oxen and the wild animals of the woods. He presses to obtain the gift of prophecy, but Apollo is under a special vow not to impart that privilege to any god whatever. He instructs Hermes however how to draw information, to a certain extent, from the Mori or Fates themselves, and assigns to him, over and above, the function of messenger of the gods to Hades. Although Apollo has acquired the lyre, the particular object of his wishes, he is still under apprehension that Hermes will steal it away from him again, together with his bow, and he exacts a formal oath by Styx as security. Hermes promises solemnly that he will steal none of the acquisitions, nor ever invade the sanctuary of Apollo, while the latter on his part pledges himself to recognize Hermes as his chosen friend and companion, amongst all the other sons of Zeus, human or divine. So came to pass, under the sanction of Zeus, the marked favor shown by Apollo to Hermes. But Hermes, concludes the hymnographer, with frankness unusual in speaking of a god, does very little good. He avails himself of the darkness of night to cheat without measure the tribes of mortal men. Here the general types of Hermes and Apollo, coupled with the present fact that no thief ever approached the rich and seemingly accessible treasures of Delphi, engender a string of expository incidents cast into a quasi-historical form and detailing how it happened that Hermes had bound himself by a special convention to respect the Delphian temple. The types of Apollo seem to have been different in different times and parts of Greece. In some places he was worshipped as Apollonomios, or the patron of pasture and cattle, and this attribute, which elsewhere passed over to his son Aristeus, is by our hymnographer voluntarily surrendered to Hermes, combined with the golden rod of fruitfulness. On the other hand, the lyre did not originally belong to the far-striking king, nor is he at all an inventor. The hymn explains both its first invention and how it came into his possession. And the value of the incidents is thus partly expository, partly illustrative, as expanding in detail the general preconceived character of the Cylenian god. Zeus and his attributes. To Zeus more amours are ascribed than to any of the other gods, probably because the Grecian kings and chieftains were especially anxious to trace their lineage to the highest and most glorious of all, each of these amours having its representative progeny on earth. Such subjects were among the most promising and agreeable for the interest of mythical narrative, and Zeus as a lover thus became the father of a great many legends, branching out into innumerable interferences, for which his sons, all of them distinguished individuals, and many of them persecuted by Hera, furnished the occasion. But besides this, the commanding functions of the supreme god, judicial and administrative, extending both over gods and men, was a potent stimulus to the mythopoeic activity. Zeus has to watch over his own dignity, the first of all considerations with a god. Moreover, as Horktios, Xenios, Ctesios, Malikios, a small proportion of his 1,000 surnames, he guaranteed oaths and punished perjurers, he enforced the observance of hospitality, he guarded the family hoard and the crop realized for the year, and he granted expiation to the repentant criminal. All these different functions created a demand for myths, as the means of translating a dim, but serious, presentiment into distinct form, both self-explaining and communicable to others. In enforcing the sanctity of the oath or of the tie of hospitality, the most powerful of all arguments would be a collection of legends respecting the judgments of Zeus, Horktios or Xenios. The more impressive and terrific such legends were, the greater would be their interest, and the less would anyone dare to disbelieve them. They constituted the natural outpourings of a strong and common sentiment, probably without any deliberate ethical intention. The preconceptions of the divine agency, expanded into legend, form a product analogous to the idea of the divine features and symmetry embodied in the bronze or the marble statue. But it was not alone the general type and attributes of the gods which contributed to put in action the mythopoeic propensities. The rites and solemnities forming the worship of each god, as well as the details of his temple and its locality, were a fertile source of myths, respecting his exploits and sufferings, which to the people who heard them served the purpose of past history. The exegetes, or local guide and interpreter, belonging to each temple, preserved and recounted to curious strangers these traditional narratives, which lent a certain dignity even to the minutiae of divine service. Out of a stock of materials thus ample, the poets extracted individual collections, such as the causes of Callimachus, now lost, and such as the Fasti of Ovid are for the Roman religious antiquities. It was the practice to offer to the gods and sacrifice the bones of the victim only, enclosed in fat. How did this practice arise? The author of the Hesiodic Theogony has a story which explains it. Prometheus tricked Zeus into an imprudent choice, at the period when the gods and mortal men first came to an arrangement about privileges and duties. Prometheus, the tutelary representative of man, divided a large steer into two portions. On the one side he placed the flesh and guts, folded up in the omentum and covered over with the skin. On the other, he put the bones enveloped in fat. He then invited Zeus to determine which of the two portions the gods would prefer to receive from mankind. Zeus with both hands decided for and took the white fat, but was highly incensed on finding that he had got nothing at the bottom except the bones. Nevertheless, the choice of the gods was now irrevocably made. They were not entitled to any portion of the sacrificed animal beyond the bones and the white fat, and the standing practice is thus plausibly explained. I select this as one amongst 1,000 instances to illustrate the genesis of legend out of religious practices. In the belief of the people, the event narrated in the legend was the real producing cause of the practice, but when we come to apply a sound criticism, we are compelled to treat the event as existing only in its narrative legend, and the legend itself as having been, in the greater number of cases, engendered by the practice, thus reversing the supposed order of production. In dealing with Greek myths generally, it is convenient to distribute them into such as belong to the gods and such as belong to the heroes, according as the one or the other are the prominent personages. The former class manifests, more palpably than the latter, their real origin, as growing out of the faith and the feelings, without any necessary basis, either of matter of fact or allegory. Moreover, they elucidate more directly the religion of the Greeks, so important an item in their character as a people. But in point of fact, most of the myths present to us gods, heroes, and men, in juxtaposition one with the other, and the richness of Grecian mythical literature arises from the infinite diversity of combinations thus opened out, first by the three class types, god, hero, and man, next by the strict keeping with which each separate class and character is handled. We shall now follow downward the stream of mythical time, which begins with the gods, to the heroic legends, or those which principally concern the heroes and heroines, for the latter were to the full as important in legend as the former.